uh, vote this year on whether, again, this is the fourth time I believe in the course since the United States took them over in the Spanish-American War, when they voted to determine whether they want to continue as a commonwealth, become an independent nation, or become a state of the Union. Now, even if they vote to become a state of the Union, it still takes an approval of the Senate and of the President for that to happen. And of course, we've had. Remember, Rick Santorum said, "Well, you've got to make English your language, or else you're not going to get in here as a state." And that might be some people's perspective, but I think it's healthy to have viable other languages, cultures that we pay attention to, and Florida in particular. For 300 years, we're about to celebrate. Some people are going to celebrate. Some people are just going to reckon and identify that we're at 500 years since Ponce de Leon came to Florida and declared it discovered for Europeans. It was discovered for Europeans. It wasn't discovered for everybody. There was people already here. As a matter of fact, they've been to Puerto Rico already and in the Caribbean, and some of that. Yeah, we've got a caller. Caller, you're on the air.
Yes. When I worked in Washington, D.C., I worked with 3 Puerto Ricans, and they said, Puerto Rico really wants to become a state, but they're losing so much stuff.
The vote has been pretty close every time. It's about 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 as to whether they want to be a state, an independent nation, or continue as a commonwealth. Nobody seems to get the traction to have the majority on that issue there. Mm-hmm.
Came over here to the United States. They got drafted into the service. And if you're living in Puerto Rico, you're considered eligible for the draft. Do they get drafted?
Yes.
Do they ever get drafted?
Sure. Yes. The Puerto Rico is a territory. The way that the United States acquired territories over time really tries to bring them in as a state. There's some discussion that we can have some more about that, because and some of that really comes out of notions of a federal system and statehood that the Iroquois nations had. I'm going to have some reading about that, and how the indigenous people here set up some of the structure and function for the United States, for our federal system, particularly as they were coming off the Articles of Confederation, because it wasn't a strong enough nation, and trying to figure out how a state could become part of the whole without giving up all of its sovereignty. And there really was no paradigm for that in Europe, and there was a paradigm for it in the native peoples, and so I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But until Puerto Rico, and most of the territories that came in always were brought in with the expectation that they would one day become a state, as opposed to part of a commonwealth or something else. Mm-hmm.
And they give you a brochure to read Puerto Rico. And one thing that was mentioned in the brochure was there were a lot of Indians in Puerto Rico, and they were all killed off by the Spaniards.
Yes, early, actually very early. And that's what I'm about to read. Let me read to you from Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans, Studies in History and Society, edited by Adalberto Lopez. Thank you for calling. Thanks for listening. In the last Indian rebellion against the Spaniards in Puerto Rico took place in 1565. It was a minor affair, primarily because at that time the Indian population of the island was on its way to extinction. Of the 30,000 to 50,000 Indians who lived on the island when the Spaniards arrived, only a few thousand remained by the early 1530s. Several decades later, 1582, the governor of Puerto Rico wrote to his king that there were almost no Indians left. Although there is evidence that suggests that Indians survived on the island into the 18th century, there is no question that between 1508 and the middle of the 16th century, the Indian population underwent a demographic decline of major proportions, and that henceforth Indians would play an insignificant role in the social, cultural, and economic development of the island. Epidemic disease were the major killer of the Indians in the New World in the 16th century, and they didn't have defenses against common European diseases such as measles and smallpox. And in Puerto Rico, these diseases alone killed far more Indians than died at the hands of the Spaniards. But because Indian society disappeared so early in the history of Puerto Rico as a colony of Spain, the Indian component of Puerto Rican culture is not as marked as the Indian component, for example, of Mexican or Peruvian culture, although you'll still find some of it there. So, Ponce de Leon and the Spaniards came, and through disease and through mistreatment by the hands of the Spaniards, they basically drove the Indian population that had been 30 to 50,000 away and off the island and gone. Well, what happened in Florida? Florida, if you recall, we've been reading from New Words, Old Songs, Understand the Lives of Ancient People in Southwest Florida through Archaeology by Charles Blanchard, illustrated by Merrill Clark. We've been reading about how the Calusa, because they were fierce, because they drove Ponce de Leon off, they rose up against, and then they rose up and they pushed off and pushed back and kept themselves from being entangled in European matters. The Calusa, although decimated by disease, were able to keep the Spaniards off of this part. And so even though Spain controlled northern Florida, and it was their territory, this part of Florida down here, Charlotte Harbor, was really didn't have the occupation. And so, but, I mean, we had 300 years that Florida was part of Spain, and so Spanish language is reasonable to be expected that it be here in Florida, and that Florida is a great place to be the connector to the Caribbean and other Spanish-speaking cultures in South America. Well, if you remember last week, as I was reading, there was the Calusa there was the story of Menendez and Fontaneda, that Fontaneda had been the young man who had been shipwrecked and captured by the Indians and lived, and so gave a time of where the Calusa actually understood through this one young man, Fontaneda, something about European culture, and then he left and was able to take some of the information about the Calusa. But 10 years, 20 years is a long time, and these kinds of time periods flip by on the pages of history, and so some of the good that might have happened, it didn't stick, and so the church, the representatives of the church from Europe, were so abrasively intolerant of Calusa customs and religious tenets that the Calusa turned against them, and the Spanish and then the Spanish soldiers had to protect the priests. And so, come around the end of AD 1568, the missionaries and the rest of the Spaniards had been driven from the Calusa capital. Several Father Rogel's priests were killed soon after. Any chances for long-term, real interpersonal relationships, as represented by the era of Carlos and Fontaneda, relationships of understanding and even friendship between the leaders of the Spaniards and the Calusa, were gone forever. This was too bad for Spain, but initially at least it seems to have been beneficial to the Calusa. They were left out of further Spanish Christianization efforts for over 100 years. Their implacable hostility became legendary. European victims of shipwreck off their shores expected to be and were killed. During this period, while European diseases were burning up more accessible, less resilient native Florida societies, the Calusa were able to withdraw from the deadly mainstream. The geography of their homeland, with its mazes of islands and shallow bays, and their specific knowledge of how best to utilize the unique geography, were of great help to them in this. They appear to have refurbished and consolidated the trade and tribute system and returned to their fishing economies with a will. But this resumption of production of marine food products proved ultimately to be their downfall. Their successful exploitation of the food resources of the interior estuary gave them something to trade with. Whatever philosophical or religious or cultural animosity the Calusa may have borne toward the Spanish people, it was no match for their attraction to European goods, specifically cloth, metal products, and most tragically, rum. The Spanish fishing industry in the Gulf was in its infancy in the 1600s. Its captain and fishermen were business people with quotas to meet. They were less rule-bound than the military or the church, and they had the goods the Calusa wanted. Fish, fishing techniques, and fishing labor began slowly to become the coin that bought the forbidden fruits of Europe. As these patterns of trade became more defined and began to become dependable, the element of real exchange among real people was reintroduced in relations between Spain and the Calusa, but only, as it were, among fisherfolk. By the later days of the 1600s, Spanish fishing captains and their crews sailed in and out of otherwise hostile Indian waters with impunity. Some even established homes and land bases that evolved into fishing ranchos of the 1700s. Working Spanish fishermen took wives among the Indians, and some eventually brought their wives and children to the port of Havana in the island of Cuba to have them officially received into the Spanish Empire. Meanwhile, on the official, political, and religious levels of communication, relations between Spain and Calusa remained clueless and doomed. In 1697, a Catholic missionary expedition came to the Calusa capital at the request of the Cacique. The priests were welcomed at first until it became clear that they had brought very little trade material with them. The Indians saw no benefit in the abandonment of their religious beliefs if their standard of living did